Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today on this November 8th, 2021. I'm Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm excited for this session with the U.S. Government Accountability Office panel. And before we get underway, I just want to thank the patron sponsors, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group. We're very grateful for their continued support so we can do programs like this in our newsletter. We also want to thank our organizational members. As you can see, it's a growing list, and we're excited to work with all these organizations and expand their message, as well as especially the Andrew James Advisory Group, who is launching an ALN A55K professional certification course starting December 6th. And I think there's only a few seats left. So reach out soon to the Andrew James Advisory Group or anyone at the ALN, and we can get you on that course. I think that's all. Before I'd say, if you're out there watching, please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat. We want to hear from you and hear what you're interested in and pass those questions along to our panelists. And I think Jack Kelly is going to make some introductions and start us off. Jack?
Thanks, Nick. This is a real pleasure for me to introduce three of the superstars in federal asset management, and they come from a place that some people might not expect. They're not the people that actually own the assets. They're the people that look over the people who own the assets. And just the three folks are from the General Accountability Office. I'm really honored to be able to say that the GAO has been a participant in the programs of the Asset Leadership Network almost since the beginning. I think initially Keith Cunningham came to our first conference and every conference since then. And then later we got to meet Amelia Shachoy, who's gonna give you one of the really interesting conversations. And we've just met Matt Cook. So these folks are basically the folks within the US government. They work for the Congress and they work at the direction of the Congress. But what they do is investigate various government programs and come up with findings about whether the government programs are working and come up with recommendations for how those government programs can be improved. One of the things, I don't think Amelia in recent years, oh, by the way, I am compelled to point out that Amelia is actually a bit of a superstar. She was recently featured by the Institute for Asset Management, the IAM, in their newsletter as one of the women in asset management. And I would, of course, consider her one of the outstanding women in asset management. She's gonna start off talking about some of the work that she's been doing most recently. But the thing I want to tell you about Amelia is a couple of years ago, she led the very first government-wide examination of asset management in the federal government, particularly real property asset management. This was the first time that anyone had ever looked comprehensively across the entire federal government at how asset management was playing out. And her report became sort of a lodestar for what the federal government is doing. And also, I think, has motivated a lot of federal agencies to start paying more attention to asset management than they had in the past. So with that, Amelia is going to talk about some of her more recent work. Then we'll chat with her about some of that work, and then she'll pass it off to Keith Cunningham, who will give his presentation and then pass it off to Matt. And so, Amelia, let's start with you.
Thank you, Jack. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to start by talking about the asset management framework just briefly that we developed a couple of years ago in the report you mentioned. And then I'm going to talk about our recent report on climate resilience and how asset management is critical to establishing climate resilience for federal agencies. I'm going to share some slides with you. And I wanted to mention that my backdrop today is a photograph from Hurricane Ida from this summer in August of 2021. And many of you may know that Hurricane Ida made landfall in Louisiana on the exactly 16 years to the day after Hurricane Katrina. And what this photograph shows you, or one thing it shows you aside from the flooding, is that if you were to look back to Hurricane Katrina, it shows you that the water rise is much higher than it was during Hurricane Katrina. So climate there was a huge impact of climate in addition to the damage from the hurricane. The water damage was more severe than it was during Hurricane Katrina because of the overall water level rise over the past 16 years. I'm going to share my screen now, just a second. And I think that you should be able to see me, is that correct? I'm guessing you can
Yep,
see.
I can see you, Amelia, and your PowerPoint. Thanks for sharing
Okay.
that.
All right. Okay, so this is our asset management framework that, as Jack said, was developed in a report a couple of years ago, just about exactly 2 years ago. And some of you watching may be familiar with it. I'm going to go over it just briefly because this is the framework that we've used in a couple of reports since then. And it shows you really that this is the whole holistic process for how asset management is done. The top level is the organizational leadership, staff, and culture. And asset management, in our view, cannot function without this top part here. Organizational strategic planning is the top level. And then this middle level, asset management strategy and planning, is where portfolio management takes place. Risk management, asset data and information, and the decision-making process. This is where portfolio management happens and where priorities are set. And this has to do with sustainability of any agency or organization's assets. This is not unique to federal government, but we did establish this based on our work at federal agencies. The next level, the asset lifecycle delivery, is probably familiar to many of you. And this is where a lot of our work at GAO and within our group in the physical infrastructure group has been done. It has to do with things like deferred maintenance, how you acquire and operate assets, how you maintain them, and how you dispose of them. And I think Matt is going to talk to us later about, in particular, disposal. And then lastly, but not still very important, the review process. And the idea here, as you can see from the graphic, is that the review process feeds back into the organizational strategic planning and the asset management strategy and planning. So this is the overall framework that we developed a couple of years ago. And from this, we developed 6 key characteristics. We had a really rigorous methodology. I'm not going to describe the details. We spent a great deal of time developing the framework, and we came up with these 6 key characteristics. Today, I'm going to talk to you about maximizing an asset portfolio's value and using quality data, which is what we focused on in our recent report on climate and natural disaster resilience. GAO has also done a report on natural disaster resilience, which is more of a reference. It was not an audit. That's why you see this SP here, that stands for special product. And we came up with a definition. This work was done by others at GAO. The definition of natural disaster resilience is here. I won't read it to you, but you know GAO, we like definitions and frameworks. And this is a definition that is used in our work now to talk about natural disaster resilience. And this is the definition that we used in our report on climate that I'm going to speak about. This gives you some very interesting information, which is from NOAA. The small print might be a bit hard to read, but the message is that just in 2020, last year, there were 22 separate weather and climate disaster events that cost more than $1 billion in damages. And each of the weather events is listed here. As you may know, weather events are increasing in number and in severity, which the dollar figure tells you. And really, you know, the climate, as we know from reading the news and from some of the recent initiatives, it's just very, very serious. And we're spending a lot of money in the federal government to do recovery, not a lot of money to do planning and preparation. In our report, this is an example of one of the things that we found. So I'm going to start to talk about our results now. What we found, and we looked at how agencies are managing, preparing for climate change and resilience. We looked at 4 agencies: the Army Corps, Fish and Wildlife Service, GSA, and National Park. But I don't think that's really too important. What's important is the main overall message. The main overall message is that, unfortunately, agencies were really not doing a lot of preparation for climate in the context of asset management in the way that I just spoke about it, looking at that framework in a holistic way in terms of protecting their portfolio or planning for managing their portfolio, and in the way that many of you who are listening understand asset management. What we found is that the agencies we looked at, and we did more than just looking at these case study agencies. We looked at a lot of literature, as we usually do. We looked at many other, studies done by outside agencies. What we found is that most agencies were doing this only for individual projects. And here's one example from the Jefferson Memorial. We were fortunate enough during the pandemic to be able to visit the Jefferson Memorial because it was outdoors. So we didn't have to worry about going inside. And we got to go up on the roof, which was being rehabilitated. I think I'm quite sure this project has been completed now. But what it shows you is that they were installing a new, you can see the new roof membrane. Oops, sorry. You can see the new roof membrane underneath here, and the tiles being replaced that had been replaced on top. Basically, this is one project where they were assessed the damage to the memorial and water damage, and they were able to do this through tools that the Park Service has developed, looking at an assessment for an individual facility, and they're able to do that. And they're able to then come up with ways to repair individual projects. This is not what we consider to be asset management. This is not a bad thing, but this is not asset management. This is managing individual assets. This is more what we have in mind. The Park Service does have a tool that they use to look across their assets. And this is an example here. The detail is a bit hard to see, but it's a really nice map where they mapped out all of the assets along the National Mall and Memorial Parks. And it's something called, which you can read here, the Coastal Hazards and Climate Vulnerability Assessment. They looked at over 200 assets. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about asset management across a portfolio. They developed this tool with help from a university where they collected data on over 200 assets, which includes facilities and other types of assets. In this case, this is just a snapshot of one area, which is the National Mall. All the different, you can see the triangles and circles and the different markings here. There's the tidal basin seawall, just to give you examples. It's not only facilities, it's other structures. And this is the kind of vulnerability assessment that looks across assets and gives you a sense of how to make decisions and what your priorities should be, and then where to make your investments. And this is what we're talking about. As many of you know, this is more of a portfolio approach and a holistic approach to asset management. That is sort of the gist of our report. A few examples, just a few illustrative examples. And to conclude, I'm just going to conclude from our report that we looked at the government-wide guidance, and you all may know, if you're familiar, and I know Jack is familiar with OMB Capital Programming Guide, it does direct agencies to identify project risks, but it does not say anything about climate or weather-related risks. And that is really important at this time when climate is such a huge risk, and a lot of the damage to infrastructure, if you just read newspaper articles, you can see it all the time. Our infrastructure is damaged due to high heat and water and cold, increasing heat and increasing cold. And if you just think of what happened over the summer, examples from the upper West Coast, Seattle, Washington State, California, where the heat was so high this summer and people are completely unprepared for that because those areas are not used to such high heat. And then other areas which have had intense cold, and it affects our infrastructure. And there's no federal guidance to handle this. There's a new executive order that came out in January of 2021 that does require agencies to develop plans. And those plans were recently came out, I think about a month ago, actually. This is requiring them to collect information on their climate vulnerabilities and then develop a plan and say something about steps they will take to mitigate the effects of climate on their facilities and operations. However, this still does not require them to incorporate any of the effects or these vulnerabilities to climate into their investment decisions. So while it's good to have data and information, it doesn't require agencies to do anything with this information. So we did make a recommendation to OMB, and I'm going to stop sharing. And we made a recommendation to OMB that they should direct agencies to do that, to incorporate the results of their risk assessments into their investment decisions. So that's.
I think Jack Kelly is going to come on and ask some questions.
So thank you, Amelia. So one of the things I'm curious about is, with all the challenges that agencies have had recently, with all these natural disasters that have gotten a lot of people focused on resilience, have you seen any of those agencies to kind of take a closer look at asset management as a way to respond or anticipate resilience challenges?
Well, the example I gave from the Park Service, where they do have that vulnerability assessment, and the National Mall where I showed you that graphic, that's just one example where they assessed over 200 assets. They do have that tool in place with that long name that I gave you, the Coastal Hazard and Sea Level Rise Asset Vulnerability Assessment. And they do have that. And there are other agencies. The Army Corps has a tool as well. There are some agencies that have that. We didn't do a government-wide survey, but as I mentioned, it's not much. Most agencies are doing this for individual projects, not on a portfolio-wide basis, which is really what needs to be done. You can't really just do it project by project, because that won't tell you how to make the best investment decisions. Right.
So I know that the agencies were supposed to have released their climate plans in response to that executive order 14008. Have you had a chance to look at any of those plans?
Well, yes, informally. That's not an official project that we're working on yet, although we may do some work on that. Informally, yes, I have looked at some of those, and a couple of other people in my group have looked at them. As you would expect, there's a mix. There are a lot of agencies. The CFO Act agencies are the primary agencies that have done them, and there's a wide range. And it is good. I think one good thing is that they have this information in one place now. So they have all this information, that they have the data and the plan of how they're going to look at their vulnerabilities and what their assets are, and it's all in one place. They vary a lot, which is, to be expected. Each agency is different. But the missing piece is what I said, where it doesn't tell you what they're going, how are they going to address this?
Yeah.
That's the piece that we recommended that OMB should require the agencies to do.
You know, it's interesting as you were talking about that executive order and you're talking about the OMB capital programming guide. One of the things that happened soon after I retired from OMB is Jim Dieter and I went around and started talking to some of the senior career officials there to promote the utility of ISO 55000 as a way to introduce asset management to agencies that would be a more useful approach than had been done in the past. And what the first thing we got, kind of pushed back at us was, oh my God, not more guidance. And of course, what agencies were responding to was all this guidance, which includes the capital programming guide, a variety of executive orders, all different parts of the OMB budget circular A11. There's tons of guidance out there.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I failed to explain to my former colleagues at the time, because I didn't understand it as well as I hope I understand it now, which is that ISO 55000 and asset management, that in the way that it proposes it, is not guidance in the way that we typically think of guidance.
Mm-hmm.
What it is, it's a way of taking a look at all the guidance you have to deal with,
Mm-hmm.
sorting it out, and incorporating your balanced assessment of how that guidance impacts your programs on your own plans.
Mm-hmm.
Your own budget requests, your own, and not just budget requests, but the budget, but it has to be more than just a capital programming guide or an agency capital plan, because it's more than investments. Investments are a piece, but it's also at a higher level is how you connect with your strategic plan. What is it you as an agency have committed to do? How do you connect that with, or let me say it differently, how you bring the different stovepipes in your agency together to come up with coordinated responses and coordinated plans for how what you acquire as assets, how you deploy them, how you maintain them, what the financing plans are to actually sustain those investments. So it's bringing all the pieces together and coming up with a coordinated set of actions that actually result in what you hope to accomplish, which is a whole different thing.
That's what our asset management framework is showing.
Exactly.
It is all one thing, and that is ISO 55000. It is one framework. It is not these little pieces and parts. It all fits together. And I will say, because our two recommendations from this report and the last report, we are not suggesting that there should be more guidance. We are not trying to pile on. We are just saying that the guidance needs to be more specific and clear. And both this recommendation and the one from the previous report, that's our intent, not to say, let's just create more guidance.
And if I'm not mistaken, OMB was silent on how it reacted to those reports, even though you made very specific recommendations to OMB. What do you see the consequences of that being?
Well, that is a disappointment because we had hoped that we could work together with OMB. I think the consequence is that agencies don't have a specific direction. So, as you asked earlier, some agencies are doing things, the Park Service, the Army Corps, and we did sign some examples at Fish and Wildlife. They're getting started with some things, but without consistent direction for all agencies to follow, it's sort of hit or miss. And that's the consequence, that you won't have consistency across the government. Mm-hmm. And that has been OMB's role. And of course, you can do it through executive order, but you don't really want to have to keep creating executive orders when something needs to be done.
Right. You just want, you don't want to have to add more guidance to the already staggering pile of guidance. Well, listen, we may touch on some of this at the end if we have time, but I'd like to switch now to Keith.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. So Keith.
I just go. Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Cunningham. I'm from GAO. And Jack was right. I have been with ALN since the very beginning. the first conference. I just want to say, ALN used to be held in a lot more interesting places than my kitchen. And I've been at the National Academies of Science and the United States Capitol. So guys, can we get me out of my kitchen for next year? Can we agree that that's what we're going to try to do? I want to talk a little bit about a report that just came out last month. It's about a capital fund proposal that's been made by 2 administrations in a row. And I got to say, not much that the Trump administration and the Biden administration agreed on, but they agreed on this proposal being a good idea. And so Congress asked us to do something that they don't usually do. Most of you know GAO does our work at the request of Congress. But most of the time we're evaluating something that's happened, either a building project or a renovation, and kind of how did it go? And in this case, they asked us to actually look forward in time and ask if we thought something would go well. A little bit tougher for us to do. So quickly about the proposal that they were making. They recognized federal property management has been on the high risk list for 19 years now, and a lot of problems. One of the biggest problems is access to upfront capital to make investments in properties. And so OMB recognized this, and they've been working with us to come up with ideas for how to fix that problem. And so they came up with the capital fund proposal. Basically, it's a $10 billion fund, brand new money, that agencies, any one of the cabinet level agencies could apply for the money and get all the money up front for any project, $250 million or more. So big projects. And they would get all the money up front, build what they were going to build, purchase or renovate, and then over a 15-year period, pay the fund back so that the fund would then be whole again and could loan that money out to another agency to build something else. And so the first question is, why do we need this fund? It's because right now agencies only have 2 options when they have a big project. Because getting all the money up front for, let's say, $1 billion project, it's just not possible in one annual appropriation. And so they either lease the building, which we'll go over there, or they can do a phased construction. This is where you kind of bite off the project in different pieces and build one piece, and then when that's done, you move to the next piece. And over the period of several years, you have a building. And so we decided to try to guess how this would work by looking at 3 projects, which were recent projects, and imagining what would have happened if they had had the capital fund at that time. And here is what we found. Let's start with the poster child of all poor asset management, the Department of Transportation headquarters building. This was a big project, boy, way back in 1998. Think about, where were you in 1998? I was getting married. And they said that if they got $294 million in that year, they could have built this building at the location it's currently located, and they'd be done with it. They couldn't get the money up front. They asked for it. And so instead, they went with the leasing proposal. Leasing is easier for agencies because they only need the amount of money for the lease payment in 1 year and any cancellation. So you can imagine it's a lot less. So they leased it for 14 years. Anybody who lives in Washington kind of knows what's happened in this area. This is right across the street from Nationals Park. Before Nationals Park was there, Nationals Park didn't move there until 2010. But since then, the real estate market has boomed like maybe no other real estate market in the country. And so as a result, last year we bought the building for over $500 million. And so the net result was $1.2 billion. It's because this number backs out the $300 million that we would have spent. So we ended up spending $1.5 billion for a building which we really could have gotten for under $300 million. So obviously, if they'd had the upfront money for this project back in 1998, good thing. Next. The next one is the Department of Homeland Security's border crossing at Calexico, California. So there was always a crossing there, but this has become a very busy area and was projected to continue to grow in importance. So they needed to basically replace the entire building infrastructure around this crossing. Back in 2007, when it was proposed, it was going to be it would have qualified for the capital fund at $275 million. So it was a good project, would have qualified. But they were going to do this in phases. Again, they couldn't get the money up front, so they were going to start by preparing the site. Then they were going to build this building. Then they were going to build the roads. And so the key with phased is you have to have a completed part. It doesn't have to be the whole part, but it has to be a usable part. And so they broke it into a number of phases, I think 4. And they started asking for money for each phase. And the money didn't come. So the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray, and this one did for sure. Many years they would get no money. They almost never got as much as they requested. And here we are today. The project is not completed, and the total estimate is over 3 times, $726 million, and I'm just going to say, and growing. And this is another example of phased. Most people thought that phased was better. I might argue that phased might even be harder than leased, because you just, at least with leased, you get the building and you get to use it immediately. With these phased projects, you pay a lot more and you don't even have anything to use. So the Nist Laboratory in Boulder, California, Colorado, I just wanted to show this because I do not have a view nearly like this out of my office window, and I would like that. So I might move to Boulder. The Boulder, NIST won't even tell us how much this project was going to cost over the entirety. They would only tell us what the first phase was going to be, because as they started the project, they started adding phases and increasing the scope of the job. But it started as a $76 million project. That's what they pitched to Congress. And now here we are, $451 million. Again, every year they go hat in hand to Congress, trying to get money for this project. And there's really no commitment from Congress that they're going to give anything. And in many years, the last couple of years, they've gotten 0. So the project is kind of just stalled. And when this happens, you have a number of cascading problems. The biggest one being the construction contractor just packs up and leaves. So you often have to recompete some elements of the construction of this. And if the construction costs rise, labor costs rise, then it ends up being more expensive than you estimate or than you have money for. But this was an interesting case, because even if NIST had gotten all the money up front, they still would have phased the project, because if you could see all those different arms there, the idea was they would renovate one section and they'd move everybody out of that section into one of the other arms. And then when that was done, they'd move them back and they'd move the people out of the next arm. And so they just kind of worked their way around clockwise, I think. So they said, oh no, we don't want all the money up front. We want to phase it. But the problem is, if you don't get all the money up front, even if you phase it, you can't get the money when you need it. So if they'd had all the money up front, they could have phased it in the way they wanted. So now we're back to, is this the best way to solve the problem? Obviously, we've demonstrated there's a problem. This is kind of like quantifying the problem, but it's unclear if this is the right solution, the new capital fund. It depends on who you ask. OMB, obviously, they proposed it. They think it's a great idea. But GSA was less sure. They have what's called the Federal Buildings Fund, which already operates in this space. It gets rent from these tenant agencies, and they use that to maintain their portfolio. And they said, gosh, if you take all the biggest projects, really the best projects, out of that, it would leave a huge hole in the Federal Buildings Fund, and it could make it insolvent over time. When we looked at it, we found there was a little bit of truth to both sides of this argument. On the one side, OMB is using some tricky math to make this work. They use something called directed scoring, which is, Jack will be able to explain that maybe even better than I can, but it's a way of scoring it so that it doesn't affect the budget the same way it normally would. Honestly, if we could just go directed scoring for all these projects, that could solve a lot of the problem. And GSA is also exaggerating the effect it would have on them. We found there are some ways it could hurt the federal buildings fund. For the most part, these buildings would end up in the long run being in the federal buildings fund. The prospects for this proposal have not gone well over the last year. Trump included in his budgets, Biden included in his budgets, he included it in his infrastructure package that he put to Congress, but the bill that just passed did not include it. And Senator Van Hollen introduced a bill into Congress to implement the fund, but that is also kind of, it's kind of stagnated. There's been no House companion bill, and it was just, it was sent to House, to Senate Environment and Public Works, where nothing's happened. So I would say that even if this was a good idea, the prospects of it passing right now are low, particularly with the bigger things on our plate. And with that, Jack, I will send it back to you if you have any questions.
Thanks, Keith. So I think one of the things I realize it might be useful to share with our audience is that, particularly those in our audience who are not familiar with the federal government, is that the federal government, let me say it differently, among the many ways that the federal government is special is that we are, as far as I know, the only entity on the planet that has something called the unified budget. In other words, unlike everybody else that has a capital budget that's separate from what they call the operating budget, we actually require that both the capital and operating budgets be presented separately, which means in simple terms that the money to pay salaries has to, or let me say it differently, the money to buy a new building has to compete with the money to pay salaries and to operate stuff. So as you can imagine, a lot of times, I mean, that's one of the reasons, because there are budget caps, you can only appropriate so much money, that within those caps, agencies are forced to make choices that basically, from their perspective, force them to do things like lease space, which costs way more over a long term than owning a space, because they, as to Keith's point, they can't get enough money in any year's budget to actually buy the building the way they're required to score that expenditure in the budget. So back when I worked at OMB, I was kind of this will come as no surprise to those who know me, kind of a heretic on this issue. I kept going and talking to people, particularly a guy named Art Steigel, who is the author of this proposal, about why can't we just go to a capital budget like the rest of the world. And Art had very good reasons why that could be a bad idea. And Art's one of the smartest guys I know, so I very much respect him. But I mean, and unlike a lot of my other OMB colleagues who kept on, as you got closer to trying to make a compelling point that the unified budget was really leading people to bad things and leading the state of the federal infrastructure to bad places, they would kind of wander off into these directions, which allowed them not to have to actually answer the questions. But Art did, bless his heart. Art would engage right on it, and he admitted that there were some kind of tricky things about the budget scoring rules. For example, although the budget scoring rules allow you to score the annual amount of a lease that meets certain rules in 1 year, that nobody questions whether or not the fact that if you're actually planning to be there 30 years, the net present value of that decision is higher than the net present value of the decision to buy. And there are people who basically, what happens is the budget rules sort of conflate, the honest way to present costs with a kind of a constructed way to present costs that's in theory designed to help you make the most cost-effective decisions. But if I've explained myself well, you can actually see that budget scoring rules sometimes end up forcing people to make decisions that aren't actually the most cost effective over time. And that's one of the things Art had to admit. But Art was the guy who dreamed this up, and it was really, for people that understand the arcana of budget scoring rules, this was a brilliant thing. I'm not sure exactly what directed scoring is, Keith, but what he did was he said, all right, we're essentially, the budget has two, but we have the discretionary budget, and then we have the mandatory budget, which are generally the entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security and so forth. So those things, that spending is in a different part of the budget than the discretionary budget. And the discretionary budget is the one that gets.
So
most
Jack,
attention.
directed scoring is when they directed CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which does the scoring, to when an agency requested, let's say $1 billion, that was mandatory spending and did not count against the 302 budget caps of each of the subcommittees.
Well, that's interesting.
Only thing that counted was the 1/15th annual payback to the fund. That was the that was on the non-mandatory side. That was on the discretionary side. So it ended up looking from a budgetary standpoint like a lease.
Right, exactly. Well, and in fact, in the real world, that's what it would look like. You'd get a mortgage and you'd make an annual mortgage payment. So it was a way to, from my perspective, it was a way to inject some common sense. Yeah, it is clever. Well, one of the things you mentioned, the GSA was upset because of threatening
Lindsay
funding.
said it's true.
Huh?
I'm looking at the chat box, and what Lindsay said is true. It's like amortize. I can never say that word right. Amortizing capital purchase.
Right. Yeah. So
Can you
anyway,
see the chat?
Yes, I'm looking at right now. But just to come back, because I can't walk and chew gum at the same time, so I have to focus on what I'm talking about. What's interesting is they're sitting, the federal building fund is sitting on a pretty substantial balance that they have to be appropriated in order to spend. And I'm wondering if any thought has been given to maybe transferring some or all of that balance to this proposed fund. And if one were to do that, is there a way to do it that wouldn't show up as an appropriation? Is there some sort of, no, so it's going to score.
So this is the question that we get from our congressional requesters all the time. We have almost $10 billion balance in the federal buildings fund. Whoa, these numbers are almost the same. That can't be a coincidence. Can't we just use one to pay the other? And it seems, yes, but the problem is that balance in the federal buildings fund, it is not actually there. That money has been used to increase other, and honestly, I've tried to walk this back. I haven't been able to reverse engineer it. I don't know where the money's gone because it's all kind of fungible at the 302B level, but it is the rent that comes in from agencies to manage their portfolio is actually siphoned into other agency operations.
Right.
To the tune of $1 billion a year.
Wow.
Yeah, the agency rent payments are propping up other agencies. So that money's already been used. So there isn't a balance like you and I would think.
Right. Right. Well, I would love to see a Wall Street Journal or a New York Times article on that, because I think that is an absolute scandal. But it's one of those things that, appropriators just like to, they're desperate for their own little piece of the pie, right? So, here's this really large pie sitting out there and just begs to be nibbled at. So that's what they do.
Right.
Well, listen, thank you very much, Keith. This was interesting. And I'm sorry that this fund proposal doesn't seem to have a whole lot of likelihood of success, because I think it's one of the smartest things that I've seen in a long, long time. But it is what it is.
We're going to keep at it, and we're going to find a way to crack this nut before I retire.
Great. Well, now I'd like to turn it over to Matt Cook. And Matt's going to talk about one of my recent favorite subjects, which is the Federal Asset Sales and Transfer Act and how that's going. So Matt, take it away.
Sure. You're going to make me follow up this fascinating scoring conversation. I'll see if I can toe the line. And I will say, Keith, I don't know that I appreciate being the new guy and being brought in after I hear that you went to the National Academies and to the Capitol. Now you're just making me sit at home, the new person. This is how a hazing of sorts?
Don't blame me, Matt. Don't blame me. It's Jack and Mike.
Yeah, no, I always blame them. So I'll just go with that. That's fair. So yeah, I'm going to talk just a little bit before I put up any slides about kind of what I'm going to get into here. And this is the other side of the life cycle, right? So Keith kind of talked about the acquisition, the upfront piece of it, and I'm going to look more at the, excuse the language, the back end of the process in terms of disposing. And similar kind of to what Keith was talking about in terms of a capital fund proposal, Fafsa is basically essentially another quote unquote innovative way, as innovative as the federal government can be to address long-standing problems, a lot of which are related to financing and costs, as we'll get into here a little bit. In particular, agencies often, and we've reported on this over several decades, lack upfront funds to remove unneeded or excess properties. And then getting into a little bit of what Jack was just talking about, those funds often compete with other agency priorities. And needless to say, when you're thinking about trying to pay salaries, expenses, maintenance costs, you usually go that direction versus trying to get rid of something that can just sit there anyway. There are other things that go into disposal that really makes it a pain for the federal government in terms of the amount of time. There are often environmental or historical preservation requirements, homelessness requirements. There's public conveyance requirements that go into this. So we don't make it easy to get things off the book. And then there's just always going to be, across the federal government, when you're managing real property, data is going to come into play. In trying to get rid or even identify what properties you're looking at. What is excess? What can the federal government get rid of? As well as just, we've had these properties for a while, and by and large, they're pretty unique. Developers aren't just like itching to come in and get one piece of land on a larger complex, for example. So actually making them enticing for others to come in and buy them, or even to get rid of some of these properties, can be a real challenge. Of course, we've now known this for a while as the federal government, and we've been trying to deal with the disposal issue. There are a number of initiatives that I'm sure many of us are all aware of. The 2004 Executive Order 13327 created the Federal Real Property Council, FRPP. There's the 2012 Freeze the Footprint Initiative. 2015, we tried to even go further and reduce the footprint. There have been a number of OMB memos and addendums to those memos over time, but still we have a problem. We can't get rid of these properties. And actually GAO has had it, this aspect, and in fact, just managing federal real property, I know Keith has talked about this a number of times, on our high risk list for now 2 decades. It's been 20 plus years where we have been trying to get the federal government to figure this out. And for those that don't know, GAO's high risk list is where we highlight what we think are the major problems across government. And this issue, more largely managing federal real property, but also disposing of properties, has been something that we've been looking at for quite some time. So with that, I'm going to put up a slide to talk about this quote unquote innovative program that we've been trying, or the federal government has been trying to get off the ground here for a while, the Federal Asset Sales and Transfer Act of 2016. So this act actually passed in 2016. Let me get these slides up. Okay, so, and everyone can see that, I assume, and someone will jump in if you can't. So the Federal Asset Sale and Transfer Act, it created a centralized process with specific roles and responsibilities. In 2016, the board was actually appointed. In 2019, it took a number of years to make that happen. And then it also set out some specific roles and responsibilities. Like I said, it created a board. It also tasked OMB and GSA with a number of things, including working with agencies. Fafsa also initiated some targeted timeframes and specific rounds. This is confusing. There are 3 rounds for Fafsa. There's the high value round, which I would think of as the first round. But then in statute, the first round is actually what I think of as the second round. So the next round.
Hey,
Yes.
Matt, I just want to say we're not seeing your presentation in slideshow mode. So we're seeing,
Oh,
there you go.
better.
Yes, perfect. Just wanted that.
Perfect.
Thank
It
you.
wouldn't be a presentation over Zoom if there wasn't a technical challenge. So I'm glad I could accommodate. So there are three rounds. The first of which is this high value round. And that's actually what we looked at. GAO by law under Fafsa is required to look at the high value round. And that's what I'm going to speak to pretty specifically. And then we also have ongoing work, and we're required to continue to look at the implementation of Fafsa. The other things that were included in Fafsa that in theory were designed to make this process a little easier, where it had some exemptions in terms of getting rid of those public building conveyances and the homelessness provisions that were supposed to help make this or streamline this process a little bit. And then getting back again to this whole funding idea, it actually created an independent fund by which any proceeds from sales would actually go into this account and then be used for future rounds to try and get properties ready. And actually there's some seed money in there that's been appropriated to the tune of about $46 million. But as we get into this, you'll see it was designed to be much bigger than that. And in fact, the first round was supposed to identify properties valued between 500 and 750 million. The next round is for up to 2.5 billion. And then we get up to over 4 billion for the final round, which will happen in 2024. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk I'm going to try and be brief on this because it gets a little in the weeds. But our report that came out in January of 2021 was really looking at the process that GSA, OMB, and the board used to identify candidates for that high value round. And I know that this is probably going to be hard to see. The type is small. So I circled kind of where I was taking us towards, which is over the course of 3 phases, GSA worked to identify some properties. There was a contractor that was involved that was hired by GSA to also help look through the data. And then when the board finally was appointed, they also did some diving into data, and they ended up with 44 candidates that they could choose from. And then the next part of that process was in the latter half of 2019, where from that 44, and this is where we actually made a recommendation at GAO. From that 44, they whittled it down to, you can see the 44 here, and then they used a kind of a tiering process and eventually got down to 12. There was a little bit of back and forth with OMB where they went from 14 to 12, but essentially they went from 44 down to 12 candidates. And we were interested in that process and kind of how the decisions were made. We've got a lot of work showing that when you're making high profile decisions, you should document those rationales. You should communicate why you're making decisions. And so we really wanted to make sure that the board was being transparent in its process, particularly because this is a pilot program effectively, right? There are 3 rounds. You need to be able to create the process, and people need to have some insight into the decisions that you're making. And I'm going to go to the next one. You can see here that I put up that in 2020 was when they actually OMB approved the 12 recommended properties for disposal. And then we commented a little bit on the framework that they used, as well as made recommendations on documenting and communicating the rationales for selecting candidates in the future. I will say that the board recently held and I'll talk more about this later, a public meeting in which they commented on this recommendation and are taking it pretty seriously. So we're happy to hear that part of it. And then also in that report, stakeholders discuss several reasons why FASTA did actually help the process a little bit, including some of the things I mentioned, the exemptions, upfront funding, and just having an independent board. I think when this was designed, folks were thinking that this would be kind of like a civilian BRAC, where you have an outside's perspective coming in and kind of leading the way. But as we also said in that report, it's kind of a little early to say whether or not we're going to address some of these issues, which takes me into where we are now. So, current status of the high value of FASTA. So the high value round, GSA has been working with agencies to complete due diligence activities. By that, I mean kind of getting the properties ready for sale. They are required by FASTA to execute sales within 2 years of accepting the report of excess. But the key part here is that GSA decides when they accept the report of excess. So they kind of set their own clock, which is why, if you recall, the recommendations were approved in January of 2020, and we are rapidly approaching the 2-year mark of January 2022, but these sales will not have occurred within that 2-year window because GSA did not accept reports of excess immediately upon those recommendations being accepted. GSA has listed 8 of the 12 high value properties for sale on its auction website. They even sold one of them. It's a parking lot park and ride lot for several $100,000. They've also awarded a couple of other properties that are in the tens of millions of dollars. But there are 3 big-ish properties that are really going to drive the results here, one of which is listed, the Auburn complex up in Washington. But 2 are still kind of being prepared by GSA. There's Laguna Niguel, they're both in California, Laguna Niguel and Menlo Park that are going to drive the proceeds and kind of determine whether or not there's going to be some success going forward. Because if you recall, those proceeds can then be deposited into this newly created account, which then can be used to drive the next round, right? So that's where the high value assets stand. And then for the next or the first round, according by statute, the board also recently commented on this a couple weeks ago at their public meeting. They are allowed to recommend properties valued up to $2.5 billion with a B dollars. It looks like they're going to fall well short of that. OMB actually, as part of a Federal Register notice that they issued in last February, had indicated that if they're going to hit that 2.5 billion mark, they would need 100 or more properties to be recommended. The board, when they just announced their preliminary list, had 15, I believe, on that list. So it looks like we're going to go well under for that round. And there's a number of reasons for that. The board kind of got into it. They've learned a number of lessons along the way. I think COVID also played a pretty big role in terms of where the real estate market was, but also as agencies are just kind of figuring out where they want to take this, where they want to take their own properties and their portfolios, as you might imagine, as they determine what kind of hybrid work environments they want and how much space they need, that could drive a need for future disposals, but they're still getting a handle on that. So it's making it hard for the board to do what they were designed to do, which is identify excess and unneeded properties. So really now what the board is doing is will submit something for the second of 3 rounds. And then they're now aiming primarily for what's the 2024 round, the last round of FASTA. And hopefully there will be some proceeds that come through the door as they start to sell some of these high value assets in the next year or so. I think that there is some hope that most of the assets will be sold by the end of 2022. And they were, as part of that public meeting, they're also highlighting some of the properties that they could target, including a couple of the best sellers, Nebraska Avenue property, the Webster School, which kind of always comes up in this context. But I did want to say that I do think that this kind of fits in the larger conversation. I know this is a pretty specific pilot program, but it does fit into this larger conversation of asset management and kind of making sure that you think about your portfolio and managing the life cycle of assets, but across your portfolio. So I do think that there is room in this conversation, even though I know I drilled down into some of the specifics here. So with that, I will pause, let Jack come back on the line and see if he has any questions for me or for the larger group.
So this is Mike Bordenaro, Director of Communications. And before Jack comes on, and please come on, Jack, I want to announce that this program is going long. It's really fascinating, and we don't want to stop the conversation. And the ALN Senior Fellow discussion will just flow naturally after this. So Jack, go ahead with your questions for Matt.
Matt, really, I was really looking forward to your presentation. I appreciate it because the process of disposing of surplus federal property has been one that actually a lot of my years in OMB were spent involved with it in one way or the other, both on the real property side and on the personal property side. And on the real property side, I remember leading one of the periodic, pushes by OMB to force federal agencies, federal agencies to divest themselves of unneeded property. Of course, there is no unneeded property, right? When push comes to shove. But when FASTA was first submitted, and even before it was passed, we had Dan Matthews was then the staff director of the congressional committee that put that together, and Johanna Hardy was his deputy. And Johanna then took over as staff director when Dan came over to be the PBS commissioner at GSA. And we've had both of them on our, at our annual conferences for a couple of years, and it was always, heartening to hear about what they had in mind. And I quite frankly had high hopes for what FAFSA would do, because it was clearly put together by people who understood the barriers that were embedded in the disposal process. And I thought they came up with a really clever way to kind of short circuit those barriers for the first round. And I don't know how many people not familiar with the federal government understand that if you have never actually tried to dispose of a big, complicated piece of property, you are going to be faced in most cases with some environmental cleanup problems and other problems that you have to spend good money to overcome in order to actually make the property ready for disposal. And for a lot of agencies, that has been a barrier, as you point out, to agencies actually being more aggressive at putting these properties on the block. One of the things, and I don't know if you happened to listen in on the Air Force presentation a few days ago, where they kind of brought us up to date on the planning model that they've developed over the last several years that basically forecasts the state of the Air Force's physical inventory, physical assets, and what those and how the state of those assets impacts mission readiness. It's one of the most fascinating presentations I've ever seen. And what they did was, this model basically said, all right, at this particular investment level, if we spend money the way we've been spending it traditionally, this is how the asset portfolio is going to degrade and hurt mission. This is the rate, this is where it's going to happen. If you make some different decisions, and the biggest initial different decision was, we're going to put a higher priority on mission critical assets than other assets. And making that switch basically shifted the way that projection came out. Everything still went to hell over time, but it kind of, the things that were mission critical degraded at a slower rate than the things that weren't. The things that weren't mission critical degraded right away, but not mission critical, who cares? But the other thing that they realize is that another thing that was draining on the resources that they had to invest in property was the cost of these underutilized properties. I mean, it's not a free good to have a facility sitting empty. You have to secure it, you have to keep it. So what the Air Force realized was, it actually was to their benefit to dispose of some of these underperforming properties, because the money that they freed up could be reinvested in doing the things that were important to getting their portfolio in better shape, which that was the first time I'd ever heard an agency come at it from that perspective. And I thought, wow, this is cool. I mean, we need people with these analytic tools, more widely spread across the government. So you're talking about how the process has kind of slowed down. And I'm wondering, did you think the pandemic had an effect on that? Is there any of that that's attributable to that, or was just bad luck?
Yeah, I think a little bit. So of course the pandemic affects everything. And I was alluding to that a little bit kind of at the end there, in terms of, in particular, agencies' plans for what they're going to do with their real property. It's a very much a moving target right now in terms of what will be excess going forward, and how they want to actually maybe shift things around. So that definitely played a role. Having said that, most of what I've seen through FAFSA so far is not that. It's not looking at new opportunities. It's really just trying to get the things that we know that we don't need off the books. And that's just been a constant struggle for the federal government. So yes and no. COVID did play a little bit of a role, but I also think that can be overplayed as well, where we just need to figure out how we're going to get some of these things that have been sitting dormant. And as you noted, I mean, there are incentives to do this. It's just kind of highlighting that, you do have to pay to hold on to these things. There are certain costs associated with having that stuff, but I don't think that agencies always see it in that lens. And also FAFSA doesn't always do a great job of incentivizing agencies to really play ball, right? It does a little bit, but I think we can do more. So I guess my is yes and no on COVID. And I would caution folks from just pointing the finger solely at that event.
So back when Keith was giving his presentation, I mentioned that the federal government is special in many ways, and one of them is a unified budget. One of the other ways that it's special is that it's on to this point, is that if you're an agency and you actually sell a piece of property, assuming you can make it through the whole disposal process where it's not given away to somebody else as what they call a public benefit conveyance. If you still have it at the end of that process and you sell it, then the money goes to the Treasury. Now, there are a number of agencies, particularly the ones with big property holdings like, DOD and VA and I think NASA possibly, and possibly DOE. They have special authority that they've been given by Congress to sell property on their own and to retain receipts. So when people think about the authorities that relate to property inside government, when it comes to real property, you've got a checkerboard of authorities. You don't just have one authority. You've got a whole lot of different authorities. They're not consistent, and they are, unique to different agencies and sometimes maybe even pieces of agencies. So from a government-wide, policy standpoint, it's a real challenge to try to think about how to rationalize all of those legislative authorities across the whole government. And quite frankly, I think that may be a fool's errand to even try. I mean, I've come to the point, having spent most of my career, in fact, all of my career, thinking about government-wide policy from the executive branch, what I've come to believe is that maybe the smartest approach is to let the agencies use the authorities they have to manage their assets in the best way that they can. And what's interesting is, and I think you guys know this more than most folks, is that asset management in the federal government has actually been sort of evolving on a case-by-case, agency-by-agency basis. And so there's not, other than GAO taking a comprehensive look at asset management across the government, from a executive branch governance perspective, there have been sort of fragmented efforts to look at government-wide asset management policy. For example, that executive order that was mentioned, Executive Order 13327, back in 2004, I think it was.
That's right.
That came out, and that created the Federal Real Property Council. It also created the Federal Real Property Profile, and it required, among other things, agencies to develop real property asset management plans, which was a real positive step forward, because those plans were intended to be tied to how real property supported agency missions, which was within the federal government sort of a new concept at that time. And my recollection is, because I wasn't tracking it closely at that time, because I had already moved over to the procurement policy side of OMB, but I did kind of look back every once in a while because I was curious. I had been involved in that for a long time, and I was very hopeful that this executive order was going to result in some wonderful things. And my recollection is that for the first several years it did. I think the guidance that the FRPC came out with, the council, I read it. I thought it was the best stuff I'd ever seen of that type. And so I was hopeful that there were going to be good things done. And then, the smart effort, mission-based effort was faded out, and we were looking at trying to, reduce the footprint and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Things that you can count. OMB loves things you can count. So basically, it's been fascinating watching this happen. And one of the things that people who have followed our conferences over the years have heard stories from agencies about the good things that they've been able to do. And that's, what I'm hopeful of. And I think I'm seeing some of this from the work that you and Amelia and Keith have done, is that agencies generally are starting to understand that asset management can be a valuable tool for them to actually make progress in managing assets in ways that are important to them. And I agree with Amelia. I think, it would be nice if we had a broad set of government-wide guidance that sort of endorsed that approach. But so far that doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, why don't we bring Amelia and Keith in to the discussion now? And since the GAO doesn't get together around the coffee pot anymore, you can exchange discussions here.
Well, do you think that's a fair comment, folks?
What's that?
In terms of the fact that sort of the landscape of asset management in the federal government is sort of these little points of light.
Yeah.
But I think I do believe that the work y'all have done has caused more agencies to pay attention to asset management, and probably helped expand the the number of points of light out there within the federal government. That's my from a distance observation. I wonder if that seems to be true from your perspective.
So
Well-
I'll start. Oh, go ahead, Amelia. You go, and then I'll add.
We can only hope, I guess. I'm not sure, but we can hope so. What were you going to say, Matt?
I was going to say that and you've done more on the asset management front than I have, but from my perspective, dealing with agencies, it does seem like the light is coming on a little bit. But having said that, you need to incentivize them to play. So you need to provide the guidance, but you also need to ensure that they're going to take advantage of these sorts of opportunities, because they're not going to just do it because it's better for the common good. As we're kind of seeing, like, for example, with the Fafsa fund, right? Like, it would be great if people would play, put money into that fund, knowing that others could then benefit, right? But we don't see that. You got to give them an upfront incentive to really get involved. And I think can be applied more widely to asset management, where I think people are starting to realize these principles, but we also need to, as Amelia said, provide the guidance and then also provide the incentives.
Yeah, I think not so much incentive, but they have to see that it's in their interest. So, I mean, I don't know what the incentive is, because we don't provide funding for people to do something or for agencies to do something, but that it's in their interest. So going back to my presentation, that if they put their investments in the assets that will benefit them the most, then their portfolios will be in better condition. That's an advantage. That's in their interest. So they have to see that benefit. And sometimes that's hard to see. That's more of a long-term view that is sometimes hard to see in the short run.
Well, the other thing that strikes me about the way we account for things within the federal government is all the attention is on capital spending, right? It's the big money, it's the capital spending. And what people pay much less attention to is what the DoD calls the sustainment spending. So, once you buy a building, that building is going to cost you many more times the acquisition costs over the time that you own it, because you have to maintain it. You got the utilities you have to pay. There's all that kind of stuff. And the same thing is true whether you're buying a car, whether you're buying a copying machine, whatever kind of asset you're buying, you are committing to what we call the life cycle cost, or sometimes the total cost of ownership, that you're basically stuck with, but you're not really paying attention to it. And so our whole budgeting process is, from my perspective, set up wrong from that perspective, because it allows you to kind of ignore these other costs that are consequences of it. And I want to tie that back into the point I made with Matt a few minutes ago, and that is that what the Air Force has figured out is they figured out how to identify some of these operating costs that are going into properties they really don't need anymore. And so now they've got a number that they compare to, if I spend this money, that instead of spending it the way I'm spending it now, if I use that money to clean the place up so I can get rid of it, then that money that I've been spending year after year after year becomes freed up within my budget ceilings, and I can spend that on something that's more productive. So part of the challenge, and maybe this is something that you guys can look at in some of your future work, is how can we start looking at spending patterns in ways that actually reveal more that's useful in figuring out what's going on, and not just pay attention to the kind of the big guys, the money that people argue about and then never gets passed, but the stuff that we're going to spend anyway, and how we can spend that better.
One of the problems that I see in doing that is kind of the short-term outlook of the high-level government managers and policymakers. Think about the PBS commissioner and what the tenure of a public building service commissioner is. It's 2 to 3 years. Right. And that's the kind of range in which you're looking at things you do having tangible benefits. And I think that's kind of what Matt was getting back to in terms of incentives. And also what Amelia was saying in terms of it has to be in their interest. And what we're talking about are, certainly with sustainment, are advantages and benefits that come decades down the line. And not that in that 3 or 4 year window of this person's administration. As a matter of fact, I heard of the new PBS commissioner, Commissioner Albert, say that, oh, the leasing cost reduction, savings avoidance plan of Dan Matthews, the previous PBS commissioner, has now come to fruition, and she is claiming credit for all of the benefits, financial benefits that that plan had. And she actually credited him with that and kind of made a joke. But in the truth, I bet you at the end of her year, she's going to say $4.6 billion saved. And where this shows is in the FBI building. So the plan with the FBI building, I don't know, when I was 5 years old, was to move out to the suburbs. And we're going to pick a great suburban location. We're going to build a campus. We're going to take all the 24 leases and the Hoover building, and we're going to throw them out to the suburbs. And so they started that process, and it was going pretty well. And then we had a change in leadership, and that's not the plan anymore. Now we're going to have it. We're going to break it down and build a new one right in the Hoover location. And now guess what? Now we've had another change of administrations, and nobody knows what's happening. And during that whole period, GSA has stopped investing in the Hoover building, like zero investments. So a bad situation has gotten worse and worse and worse. But what should the FBI do? How can they manage that asset smartly? And GSA too. Should they be investing in the Hoover building? Well, I guess 20 years ago, they should have been.
Making some strong cases for just outsourcing the whole real property portfolio and leasing it back.
Finding a way to get some long-term vision would be critical to solving these problems.
Well, that is a plug for some work that we're doing now. And I know, Keith, one of your slides was going to be on our ongoing and future work, but we are doing some work now on deferred maintenance. And it's very prescient to this conversation because some of the agencies, when we looked at the climate work, they said, oh, we can't invest in climate resilience because we have so much deferred maintenance. We have to take care of that first. And that is just not the way to think about it, because you can't think about fixing things before you look at what you need for the future. It has to go hand in hand. So that's something that we're working on now. Did you want to go over this, Keith? You're on mute.
Trying to find the right button.
Yeah, well, you know, when you're in share mode, it's hard to mute and unmute. Let me, wow, now I've really done something here.
Slideshow.
There we go, and slideshow. I had to go out of slideshow to. Okay, so these are our upcoming projects. This is kind of like coming soon. And if you come to ALN in a location outside my kitchen next year, you'll hear about these reports. The first one comes out next month. It's on courthouse planning. There are a lot of courthouses, 400 in the country, and they're all average over 50 years old. And they really need some new investment and sometimes a new courthouse. And so, but there's not a lot of money for these things. So all the courthouses are competing for the small pie of investment. And so how the judiciary decides where to put those investments, they have this whole courthouse planning process, which could be considered an asset management process. It really is that. But just because you have a process doesn't mean the process is a good one. So stay tuned. The next one is the GSA prospectus process. Everybody hates the prospectus process. GSA hates it. The Congress hates it. The only people who really like the prospectus process are us. Because it is the one contract between GSA and Congress to what the heck are they actually going to build, and how much do they think it's going to cost, and when do they think they can do it by. So we always use these prospectuses against GSA to measure their progress. And my colleague Mike Arms, who I bet a lot of you know, he's coming out with this report also very soon. Matt has already talked about our Public Buildings Reform Board work, but Matt, it's ongoing, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So we'll get into some of the issues that I teed up as part of that discussion, but we can go on to, I think, Amelia, you want to talk about deferred maintenance?
I think I made my point.
Okay, and
Okay,
then I
and
can
then-
round it out with the space planning, which I also discussed a little bit. But GAO is taking a pretty wide view, first crack here. It's an evolving situation, but kind of identifying what agencies did immediately following the pandemic and what they're planning to do in the next couple of years as the workplace evolves fairly significantly across the federal government, as we think about telework and also a little bit of like reentry and the technologies that we need to continue to do our work, but perhaps in a different way. So to a theater near you sometime soon, next
And then
summer.
the after COVID is the piece that we're going to be picking up after Matt's finished. And that will be looking at the enormous opportunity that the federal government has when it does move back into the offices to reimagine how they measure space utilization and how they plan for future space needs. The best place to save money in real estate is in shrinking your footprint, moving forward. If you need half the space, you pay for half the space. And so we want to help agencies come up with maybe a different way of figuring out how much space they use, moving away from the 250 square feet per person kind of metric.
Well, now you've hit one of my favorite topics, which is don't think about space without thinking about the work that it has to support. And that's one of the problems that a lot of agencies, including GSA, have done by saying, oh my God, we have to create these hoteling situations, we have to create this and that because it's going to reduce our footprint, but they've created workspaces that people actually can't get work done in. So it's at least not in the way that they feel most comfortable doing that work. So to me, where that process needs to start is you have to re-envision the work that your agency does in ways that still preserve your ability to get work done that's important to your agency and has any other human resource aspects to it that are important, whether it's, people taking care of, little kids at home or whatever you have to think really holistically and make smart decisions about the nature of the work you're trying to support, and then ask yourself the questions: what kind of space is the right space configuration to support that work? But start with the work first. So with that, thank you all so much for this conversation. I mean, you guys are some of my favorite people in town, and it's always fun to be able to chat with y'all. And oh, by the way, on the prospectus, Keith, I was never involved within OMB, but I think OMB loves prospectuses because it's one other stranglehold that it has on agency funding decisions. And they love that.
Well, thank you.
When everybody hates something, there's probably something good to it.
Yeah, could well be. No, it makes people answer tough questions, which is important to do.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure.
Thank
So
Live and
you.
prosper, guys.
And
Yes, indeed.
Keith
I wish I could do that. I used to be able to do that.
and Matt,
Yeah.
thank you all. And we're going to continue with an ALN Senior Fellow discussion, and you're welcome to stick around because part of it will be about federal accounting. And Rich Culbertson, who is also an ALN Senior Fellow and board member, just as Jack Kelly is an ALN Senior Fellow and board member, are going to be having some discussions. So I'll stick around, Jack, but you take it away.
Thank you, Mike, because I want to start with that. I mean, Rich is one of the people that I know who understands something. He's been able to comprehend the scope of not only federal, accounting standards, but accounting standards in general in a way that I don't have enough lifetimes to comprehend. So I had always admire what he brings to the table in this subject. But one of the little sidebar points I'm going to make as we begin this part of the discussion is one of the things that was most fascinating for me to learn when I first started learning about asset management. And I'm sorry that Michael Hardy couldn't be on this call because Michael and I, worked together on a history of asset management several years ago. And one of the things that we tried to, sort out in looking at that history was, what is considered the beginning of it? And there are a lot of different thoughts about that. One of them actually has to do with US transportation grant programs, but the one that seems to get the most time on the internet is Australia. And they were, kind of credited for being one of the pioneers in developing asset management as we think about it today. And frankly, I think they're the gold standard for asset management in practice these days. But one of the things that got them started, at least as was explained to me, was a requirement by the Auditor General in Australia, which is like the Australian GAO, that required municipalities to report, to use accrual accounting to report on their financial costs and account for their expenditures and their investments and so forth. Accrual accounting, which basically means you show the effect of the revenue or the expenditure in the time frame that effect is supposed to occur. At least that's what I think it is. Rich will correct me if I got it wrong. But in addition to that, and what was even in my mind more important than that, was the requirement that you show that you record assets on your balance sheets according to the international financial standards, which says you record the assets on your balance sheets at what's known as fair value. And fair value is intended to be a representation of what you could get if you sold that asset for. And so the way it was explained to me, municipalities, which in Australia have the authority to sell their assets and retain proceeds, could all of a sudden start seeing a direct connection between how they invested their money, how they spent their money on maintenance, repairs, replenishment, all that kind of stuff, and the effect that their spending had on the state of their assets. And so if you spent money poorly, your assets were going to degrade. The fair value was going to go down. If you spent money well, that degradation might happen more slowly, or in some cases, then it might actually increase the value of the asset. So it was that link between spending and asset value that was like, oh my gosh, well, what's the secret of doing that? It was better asset management was the answer. So that's what I took away from that, Australian thing. And I'm wondering, Rich, how does that work from your perspective?
Well, I think particularly on ISO 55000, the definition of an asset is a thing, an item, or an entity. And so when you think of entity, you can think from an accounting perspective and saying, well, just what's on the balance sheet. Or you can say, well, let's get away from just what's on the balance sheet. Let's go to real value and fair value. A few weeks ago, I think we heard that perhaps there'd be taxation for those who are worth over $1 billion or so, that they would be charged for unrecognized capital gain. Now just think about that. What is that? Well, it's something you haven't sold yet, but if you did sell it, that's how much money you would get. But at the same time, that's an intangible asset. And so the question is, should that be managed under your asset management system? Well, I think the answer is yes. Particularly if you're a small investor or you're even a large company. What's the advantage of having that unrecognized capital gain? I remember, for example, when Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta. Martin Marietta bought a very large portion of Orlando years back. Well, that became a very good source of income for Lockheed Martin because of having that land. Now, of course, that's out of the question. You think of companies buying a bunch of land. But the fact is, land's a good investment sometimes under certain circumstances. Where that comes apart, however, a lot of times it all depends upon the incentives. If you have, for example, the cost accounting standards say, well, you can't charge interest. Or so if you can't charge interest, how does that work? That means, well, maybe you lease. So you have to always be careful with what the incentives, are placed upon an entity. Now, if you're a small investor, like I'm a small investor, and so I think as a manager of a small investment, I think about, unrecognized capital gain and the importance of that. I also think about some of the things that were discussed earlier, things like deferred maintenance. The advantage, though, as a small investor, is you're able to make the decisions and in a timely manner, and so if you have the ability to be the decision maker and all these things, that becomes a much more advantage in the management of assets.
So, I keep wondering what role GAO plays in federal accounting standards. I know the Federal Accounting Standards Board, FASB, is the entity that actually sets the accounting standards for the federal government. But I think GAO plays some role. I just can't remember exactly what it is.
I think it was kind of mentioned earlier that it's the whole review process. It's important that GAO actually get in there and find out what's happening as far as accounting, to make sure things are being managed and accounted for as required. I know from what I've seen, I kind of developed my life in like 4 different areas, quadrant. I have my retirement life, which is getting smaller. I have my asset portfolio life. I'm also involved in utility accounting and utility management. I'm also involved in standards and ALN and such. They all kind of are under the area of asset management. Each area helps one another. One becomes a test bed of the other. And I think that all these things become relevant, whether it be accounting or whether it be management or whether it be deferred management or how we mine opportunities. And so I hope that answers your question.
Well, it's having GAO involved and supportive of what we've been doing for these years, I think is a huge plus, and says a lot for what we in the ALN have been able to do. One of the things that I don't know how many folks are aware of is that the ALN has a presence in the U.S. Technical Advisory Group, TAG, to TC 251, which is the international committee under ISO that's responsible for international asset management policies. And so Jim Dieter, our chair, was as CEO, as you know, Rich, and you were part of that team, I believe, that went over there and helped develop the first ISO 55000. And Jim was the team leader for that effort. And since then, he is an active member of the ALN, and I mean, as the US TAG, as have you, and several others of the ALN folks are on that. And I think, that's been exciting for me to learn about and to be a little bit of a piece of. How do you feel about the work that the TAG and the TC 251 are doing these days?
I think everything is kind of circular. That those of us who have experience in business and government and our own, whether it be retirement or our portfolios, we learn from that, and that applies to standards. And at the same time, it's good that the GAO members are also involved in that to make sure that they have input that also can impact those standards. At the same time, everybody becomes smarter of actually how to manage large organizations, how the standards have impact on large organizations, small organizations. And so I think in a lot of cases, what we hear from GAO, it's repeated elsewhere, but it requires everybody to participate in this. Everybody benefits from good asset management. When we see disasters that was mentioned from the GAO, you can probably source those things back. But why did they happen? How did it happen? And sometimes it's just bad internal controls. They did not identify their objectives of resiliency to make from those disasters, didn't plan to make sure that the disasters wouldn't have the negative impact of which they did, and to make sure that there were people who were responsible to make sure that risk was minimized. And so all this stuff, I think, connects from one another.
Yeah, I thanks for making that point, because I know in a lot of conversations that we've had, you often come back to the subject of internal control, and a lot of folks who aren't in the accounting business or management policy business may not understand what internal controls are, but it's just making sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And it's and one of the things that I find fascinating about that is that internal control, when you think about asset management comprehends internal controls. It comprehends all the things an organization does to manage assets well to accomplish its objectives. And there, as what you realize when you learn about ISO 55000 and the I 55001 and so forth, is that one of the things that struck me when I first read ISO 55001 was being aware of what they call the context of the organization. And the context of the organization consists of all the external and, quite frankly, I think internal conditions that managers, senior managers of an organization have to be mindful of as they proceed to develop their plans, whether it's a strategic plan, asset management plans, financing plans, all that stuff. You have to understand what sort of forces you have to be aware of and responsive to. Things like, pandemic occurred. Oh my gosh, well, we have to change something. Or the political climate in my country is such that certain actions are encouraged and other actions are discouraged. The accounting standards are such that certain activities show up in this way in my, operating budgets and my balance sheets, and other activities show up different ways. So it's understanding all of those, essentially it's like the rules you have to operate under. And some of those rules have to do with rules on how you need to treat your employees, because you may be in a union environment and you have to bargain for certain things. So it's comprehending the full range of, again, what we call the context of the organization as a starting point for deciding how you're going to, determine your objectives, how you're going to actually accomplish those objectives, and so forth. And so it's that holistic view that is not normal to most organizations that I have ever worked in federal government. People are, they're fighting fires. It's what came over the transom today, and it's how can I respond to the current crisis, basically. Not how can I take a long-term view and kind of manage the crises as they come, but manage them in the context of what they mean for my whole organization, from a risk perspective, from an opportunity perspective. How do you have the big game board, if you will, that's got all this important stuff on it, and that allows you to see the consequences of managing a particular piece in one direction. What does that do to the other pieces, and what you're able to do? So to me, that's what asset management does. And it's frustrating to me that it's been so hard to explain that in ways that are compelling or convincing to senior government managers. So it's just like, hello, it's a lot of people have figured this out, but we haven't.
Well, a bunch of years ago, I had a manager talk about asset management being part of the fabric of the organization. Well, I think asset management is a part of the fabric, an important fabric of the organization. The other thing about internal controls, and again, it's part of that framework that Amelia talked about, that we all have a framework of how we visualize how this stuff works. Well, internal controls, particularly the cost of internal control framework that is expressed in the GAO Green Book. And if you haven't read the GAO Green Book, it's an excellent book to read. Particularly of how to manage things, that it does start with objectives. Then once you have your objectives, then you determine for that particular segment of your business, is it effective and efficient? Just ask your question, is it effective and efficient? If the answer is no, then you have work to do. If it's yes, then you're probably okay. Then you also ask the next question, well, does it provide reliable reporting for financial and non-financial? And again, those yes and no questions. If it doesn't do that for good decision-making, then it needs to be improved. Then the third aspect is it compliant with laws, regulations, standards, contracts, tariffs, a whole series of things, company policy. And if it is, that you're okay too. Eventually, you will determine it. Well, if you do all those things, you're probably doing pretty good and you should be able to meet your objective. If on the other hand, there are weaknesses, identified weaknesses or deficiencies, those things too need to be brought out and reported to management. And then management has a responsibility to fix those things, as well as everybody else in the organization is required to fix it. So all the asset management as well as internal controls has to be throughout the whole area of the organization. And again, each situation is different, and its management is required to, in fact, define what those are.
Yeah, it's, everybody, what you realize is that there are so many different audiences that we have to talk to. And every audience kind of is used to its own language, and there are things that are important to one audience that make no difference whatsoever to another audience. And so one of the challenges that we have in the ALN is how we kind of tailor our various messages to the audiences that we're trying to engage with those messages. And it's for me, it's a continual learning process, which is fun.
Well,
One of the things I think is important too, though, is to recognize a lot of times we as leaders and such, we are in the forefront of thought of asset management. Sometimes though we have to stop and look and try to pick up the rear in some of this stuff. And that's what my other thing is about utilities and gas companies and those things and how that type of stuff plays. And it does play. And some of the discussions a little earlier is that some organizations just don't get it. They don't follow directions. They're on their own schedule. They're so focused on what they're doing, but they're not looking at the big picture, or they're maybe focused on taking the credit, where credit may not necessarily be due, or they're focused on the wrong objectives. But it's important though, society in general, whether the press or ourselves or those who know, get involved to try to make sure that those who are lagging behind are stimulated to, in fact, they get with the program, because our livelihood, everyone's livelihood, as well as the public good, depends upon a certain amount of compliance and getting with the overall standards of how this should work.
Well, Rich, you made the transition that I wanted to make, that you had been talking at this high-level accounting perspective, but you have personal experience in dealing with the asset management of gas utility assets, specifically your own. And we've got some time to talk about how you're putting asset management into practice in your own life. And it's actually has a ripple effect across the entire utility industry. Can you give us a brief overview of what you're up to?
Yeah, well, when I left Lockheed Martin, I moved to Pittsburgh and we started investing in real property. And I had an negative experience with my gas company, where they had abandoned my customer service line. Now, being an asset management person, I know what abandonment means. I mean, I know that the rules of abandonment, such as that abandonment has to be done by an owner. And so this led into other things, that non-compliances, in other words, taking of somebody else's property is a big deal, particularly when it's your own. And so as we started going through that process to make those corrections, and we went up to the leadership and the CEO and CFO of the corporation, they still didn't budge. Then that resulted in complaints to the Public Utilities Commission. But then with those things, it all also came to light. Things like, well, is the Public Utilities Commission operating to the standards which they should be? For example, if the state government receives a grant of some sort, those grants must be operated consistent with what's called 2 CFR 200, which is the regulation of OMB of grants. And that includes, it's about 400 pages of what they should be doing. But it's all good stuff, of how the stewardship of the people's money. And part of that, of course, is the operating to the GAO Yellow Book on audits, the GAO Green Book on internal controls. Well, the Public Utilities Commission in Pennsylvania wasn't operating to those after they've been out for about 10 years. Well, then you start looking for more things. Well, you see that the Pennsylvania Constitution requires the commission to have operate to generally accepted auditing standards. Well, what is that? Well, that's the Yellow Book. Well, they didn't do that either. So that means annual audits. So when you have companies that are responsible for certain things, to do things annually and it's not done, and of course an audit is a way of continuous process improvement. If you don't have continuous process improvement, then some of those things that should be done are not being done, which causes enormous harm.
So Rich was personally harmed by the abandonment of a line to one of his properties. And because the gas company got his attention, Rich started paying attention to calls for public comment on gas utility proceedings and initiatives. And Rich has been consistently one of the few people who makes public comments about his gas utilities operation and management of their assets. And it's quite a fascinating story that is still unfolding. And what we see from the asset leadership perspective is the ability to use Rich's personal experience as a showcase of how utilities should be managing their assets in a way that is beneficial to the organization, because some of this stuff could result in death and injury to people and destruction of property, gas explosions. It has happened numerous times already.
One of the things, a couple of things, there was a recent case where the Public Utilities Commission wanted to have comments from the public, and their proposal was that public utilities would take over a customer service line or a property belonging to an owner. And where the utility would come in and change things and do things and hand the bill to the landlord or the owner. Well, the taking of property is basically discussed in the Fifth Amendment of our Constitution. You know, if someone's property is taken over for public use, then that sounds like something that should be under the practice of eminent domain. Well, they didn't want to go through that process. They just wanted to make a regulation, to use the regulation to change that. Well, when it came out for public comment for the state of Pennsylvania, I was the only person who was not a utility, a private individual. So you take out the full population of Pennsylvania and only one person from the public comments. And it was actually kind of brutal because you have no authority, legal authority, to do what you're asking, which reflects poorly on the people of the Public Utilities Commission. They should never brought this before the public and asked to do something that was illegal. The other thing which has also been kind of trying is the whole process of getting involved in a rate case. And each utility has a rate case on the increase of rates to customers. And there, what I found, which was there was an order from the commission to have a inspection of investigation of the rates, the current rates, and also the proposed rates. Well, then they required a administrative judge to look at the rates themselves, but there was no one assigned to investigate. The administrative judge could have hearings, but there's no investigation. So in the end, what has happened so far is that about the 18 lawyers of the various sides who in fact have various types of interest, they voted to in fact increase the rates another 12% or so, but yet not investigating at all. Well, violating an order is a bad thing, but yet that's what they did. And so this is not over yet, but the fact is that once you see the sausage being made, sometimes things get in there that shouldn't be there. And it's important for the public, in fact, to understand what that is, to actually see how it works, and then, of course, demand that those changes take place and that those promises of fair and just rates are fulfilled.
I think that's a great point, but so many people just get discouraged with official actions, and they feel like they're not empowered, that they're just victims of these large organizations and these large governments, and they feel disconnected from the process of figuring out what the laws and regulations should be. And that's a real problem. You have to governments, I think, need to take the leadership in assuring their people that they're important, their views are important, those views are going to be paid attention to. If they have a question, they'll be provided an answer. They may or may not agree with the answer, but at least they're going to get one. And it's a way to create a real dialogue between governments and the people governed. I mean, and that's one of the real problems, I think, in a lot of countries, including ours, that there's a disconnect that's grown between the governing processes and the people who are affected by those processes.
Well, I talked to one of my state senators once, and I was going through some of this stuff, and he says, I have no idea what you were talking about. you're going to have to write a book to explain things like the yellow book and green book and how all this stuff's supposed to work in government. And even though the person's a lawyer and has been in state government for a long time, had no clue about the overall controls and the governance of a state. And so some of that stuff is not communicated. There's no school you go to learn this stuff or how the whole thing works. I don't think universities even talk about how all this whole thing works. The only way you learn it is by being around for a long time, reading a lot and observing a lot and validating what you think is true. I'm sure, Jack, that's what you found also, is that when you see a lot, do a lot, and you read a lot, you have a certain amount of opinions that you draw, and you also see where things are not right and there's things how to be improved. And also one of the advantages of getting older is that sometimes you become less tolerant. You know, you see things and say, hey, not right, you're not going to stand with it anymore. You know, and that's a good thing too. But again, it's important to get involved in those things because that's how our society is improved. Otherwise, you have to be satisfied with what you got, and what you got may not be acceptable.
Well, unfortunately, you don't have to be satisfied with it. You can be disgruntled with it, but it's
Yeah, right.
That's not a happy place to be.
One of the things that I like about ISO 55000 is that it gives a structured approach to helping people understand how to manage these complex processes.
Absolutely.
And it is hard and it is difficult, but there is a path forward.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a while. I was going to say it took me a while to learn a meaningful amount of information about ISO 55000, but the truth is I'm still learning. But early on, I thought, oh my God, this is, if I've ever seen a silver bullet for making things better, this is it. And I still believe that. However, it's how to convince other people of that is a huge challenge because, you know, they just don't want to believe. I was going to say believe it's that simple, but it's not simple. I mean, ISO 55000 it's like, in fact, I think I told you and Jim and others this after I first read it. I said, you know, this is like a whole lot of common sense. I mean, all of these things in here are things that if you've had a long career and been involved in organizational, the kinds of stuff I was involved in, you've learned a lot of these lessons over the course of that career. And it's just a whole bunch of stuff that, you know, oh yeah, we got to do this, change management, got to involve the stakeholder, all this kind of stuff is stuff that you learn. But the thing that about ISO 55000 was it was all there together in this one place. And it's, when you put it all in one place, it's a lot. And so it kind of is mind blowing. In fact, I think you heard me talk about how I had a hard time getting my head around it early on. And it wasn't until I saw that 6-block model that I thought, aha, now that you're dealing with, you know, I've got enough fingers and toes to count this many things. And so I can figure this out. And that was hugely helpful to me and understand in one way to look at what the standard says that was useful to me from a lot of different perspectives. But it's just, you know, it's hard to tell that to people in a way that they get it, because I didn't get it for a long time. And it's something we still struggle with. But we're having fun.
In my life, I know this. I've been involved in quite a bit of music, you know, from early on, not much now, but the fact is the way to learn, one, join a choir. Well, that's the same thing. This is too. Join the choir, learn about it, be within groups like ALN, try be around others who understand this and those who understand more than others. Hang around with that. Next side, if you're really, really good at music, get yourself a private teacher. You know, and then with that, other than that, hold yourself accountable. Do performance, auditing, those things. All this stuff kind of connects, but there's lessons you can learn from the musicians in the process of getting good at that. And it does take a lot of practice, a lot of mistakes, and recognizing a mistake when you hear one. And that's the same with ISO 55000. Understand what mistakes look like.
Yeah, one of the things that I had considered talking about in this session, but I think it doesn't make as much sense here as possibly tomorrow. And that's one of the things, Mike, about, I think I told you and Jim, some of the work that we've been doing on the NALS, the National Asset Leadership Strategy, is proving to be really, really helpful in the work that I'm doing on Working Group 7, which is developing that international standard ISO 55011, which deals with, essentially, it's how you engage governments in implementing asset management. And this has been one of the most, it's frustrating, but it's also one of the most fun exercises I've ever participated in, because it's causing me, it's giving me an opportunity to connect some of the principles of ISO 55000, which, for those of you who paid attention to it, it's focused on organizations and how organizations need to behave, or how they can behave to be more productive and effective as organizations. 55011 is not focused on organizations. It's focused on, in the current version of the document says, create an enabling environment for asset management through public policy. So when you think about an enabling environment, when I think about enabling environment, I've come to understood it kind of like the context of the organization that I talked about earlier. It's all the conditions within which organizations function. And when you think about it that way, what I think about this, so you've got conditions in the context of the organization, but those conditions are created by stakeholders. So there is a connection between the stakeholders, and the context of the organization. And with respect to an enabling environment, they're what I'm calling participants in the enabling environment, very much like stakeholders. So what I've been so far able to do, and I don't know whether it's going to survive till the end, but I've been able to kind of create some parallels between the concepts that I'm trying to introduce in ISO 55011 and what's already in the ISO 55000 series. And this may, just to fast forward to where I think I'm going with this, and this is, there are two things that I take from 55000 that are important to the key players in an organization for asset management. One is competence. You have to have people who are competent in what the organization's about. And the second thing, and these to me are the top two, competence and collaboration. It's making sure that you collaborate across all the silos with all the and connect with the stakeholders. And so what that does to me in the standard is it says, participants in the enabling environment are basically government, or you can divide them a lot of ways, but the way I think it makes the most sense is government organizations, which are the only parts of the enabling environment that can actually issue public policies, and then non-government entities. And what's interesting is when you think about competence, the competence is mainly in the non-government entities. It's in the people who are the asset management specialists, people in the ALN, people in advocacy groups, not only for asset management, but the professional associations that have embraced asset management. That's where the competence in. And to some extent, you've got some competence in the administrative activities of government where they've actually done it. So you've got within various government agencies that have adopted asset management, you've got some competence there. But on the legislative side, not so much. And then at the legislative side is the foundation for creating these public policies. So that's how that's sort of the competence map looks like that. So how do you make it better? Collaboration. You have to improve the collaboration between those people in government who make the policies and the people both inside and outside of government who actually have the expertise on which you need to base those policies. And I really think it's as simple as that. And the whole thing is what I think you're talking about: speaking up when you need to, getting involved when you need to, and also getting in things that maybe somebody consider not your business, but in fact it is when it impacts you. Anyway, I'm having fun. This is.
Well, this has been an excellent discussion among senior fellows. We are sorry that Michael Hardy was not able to join us, but that This means that most of our senior fellows have participated in our conference this year, and we thank you for, both of you being on the board. Great appreciation for that, and for being senior fellows and advancing the cause of asset management in your targeted areas, which is why you are senior fellows. So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity.
And thank you to all the audience members who participated by attending and for your comments. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Nick, too.
Thank you. Bye now.